All right, time for Tickety-Boo News. This is like being in a madhouse, I want to get back to the idea of Donald Trump because I said something yesterday that I actually stopped for a minute. I talked about Trump just dismissing the racial narrative, the narrative that has been the absolute web in which the mainstream media and the Democrat Party, but I repeat myself, they're both the same things, has wrapped up the Republicans so that they are afraid to talk, afraid to move, afraid to gesture. And the narrative is basically, if you are not accepting left-wing premises and left-wing possibilities and left-wing language, if you are not accepting those things in the way that the left wing says you should address problems, you are a racist. And being a racist in America, with its history of racism, its true history of racism, is one of the worst things you can call a person. It's a terrible, terrible thing to call a person. I would never call a person racist unless they were actually being racist and accepting racist premises. Whereas, for instance, you get this stuff from John Blake at CNN where he basically says we're all racist by default. If you supported Donald Trump, you're a racist. It's not so much the people who are the white supremacist, angry, violent guys. It's easy to focus, he says, on the angry white men in paramilitary gear who looked like they were mobilizing for a race war in the Virginia college town. But it's the ordinary people, the voters who elected a reality TV star with a record of making racially insensitive comments. And that's the key thing. He defines what is racially insensitive. So everybody, for instance, when Trump went after Obama on that ridiculous birther thing, and it was ridiculous. They all said that was racist. I didn't think it was racist at all. I mean, Obama was not like one of us. He was not like your typical American who loves his country, who thinks this is a great country, who's grateful to be here, thankful to be here. He had all these weird anti-colonial leftist ideas, and so people felt he was not like us. That was what spurred that. It had nothing to do with the color of his skin. If it had, we wouldn't have elected him twice, and many of the people who voted for him voted for Donald Trump the next time out. So Trump has shattered this. And it's funny, it only occurred to me this morning that I wrote a whole book about this. I wrote a book called True Crime, which is a thriller novel, which was made into a film with Clint Eastwood. And when they wrote the film, and Eastwood talked to me about this, and the writer who wrote the film talked to me about it, they changed the defendant in the case. It's about a guy on death row, and is he innocent or is he guilty? And in the book, he's a white guy. He's a white guy, and they changed him to a black guy, which made the entire moral essence of the film disappear. The entire moral essence, because the idea of the story is the star of the story is a reporter named Steve Everett, who Clint plays, who's a jerk. He cheats on his wife. He doesn't pay attention to the stuff we were talking about before about balancing work and home. He doesn't do any of those. He's nasty. He says ugly things. But he's the only guy who can get at the truth because he won't be stopped by the PC narrative. In order to bust through to the truth, you have to be nasty enough to bust the PC narrative. Steve Everett is Donald Trump. I suddenly realized when I woke up that I was telling that story because Donald Trump has a lot of things about him that I don't like. Sometimes he's nasty, sometimes he's bullying, sometimes he uses language I don't like. But he is the only guy, and this is why people like John Nolte and everyone love him so much. He is the only guy who has burst through this narrative that if we say it this way, it's not right. If I talk about Charlottesville in this way, then I'm a racist. And anybody who says he's not a racist is a racist himself. And anybody who doesn't run for the hills and grovel before the press and say, please, please forgive us for even looking at Donald Trump while he was talking about Charlottesville is, in fact, a racist. And all of this stuff, he is breaking through this narrative that has put a stranglehold on our conversation, on the relationships between us as Americans, and on our politics, so that they are controlling even like the things people think or are willing to say. And it's interesting. The other day in the Philadelphia Inquirer, there was an article by Amy Wax, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and Larry Alexander, who is a professor at the University of San Diego School of Law. And it was called Paying the Price for Breakdown of the Country's Bourgeois Culture. And this is what it says, very briefly. It says, too few Americans are qualified for the jobs available. Male working-age labor force participation is at Depression-era lows. Opioid abuse is widespread. Homicidal violence plagues inner cities. Almost half of all children are born out of wedlock, and even more are raised by single mothers. Many college students lack basic skills, and high school students rank below those from 24 other countries. The causes of these phenomena are multiple and complex, but implicated in these and other maladies is the breakdown of the country's bourgeois culture. That culture laid out the script we all were supposed to follow. Get married before you have children, strive to stay married for the children's sake, get the education you need for gainful employment, work hard, and avoid idleness. Go to the extra mile for your employer or client, be a patriot ready to serve the country, be neighborly, civic-minded, and charitable, avoid coarse language in public, be respectful of authority, eschew substance abuse and crime. These basic cultural precepts reigned from the late 1940s to the mid-1960s. They could be followed by people of all backgrounds and abilities, especially when backed up by almost universal endorsement. Adherence was a major contributor to the productivity, educational gains, and social coherence of that period. So, of course, what happened? Suddenly, these guys are under attack. This is toxic. The Students' Union at Penn says this is toxic, racist, sexist, homophobic. Superiority of one race over others is not an academic debate we have in the 21st century. The kind of hate Wax espouses is an everyday part of many students' lives at Penn. The ideal council representing, they say, marginalized graduate students of the University of Pennsylvania called for them to be silenced. We demand, of course, they always have a demand, a statement from the university specifically designating racist, homophobic, sexist, transphobic speech as hate speech and censoring it. Okay, so in other words, they have now created this narrative where to call for people to act responsibly like bourgeois people is racist because somehow this is not black culture. This is not black culture, that you get married, before you have a baby, that you get an education, that you respect authority. So they've shut that whole thing down. Jason Riley is in the Wall Street Journal, and he's at the Manhattan Institute, so he's a colleague at because I write for City Journal at the Manhattan Institute, and I should mention he's a black guy and he writes a lot about race. He writes this. He says that he's talking about the fact that the left is pushing this narrative that dysfunction in black communities traces back to slavery. And so it always has to be solved by somehow recompensing black people for slavery and for bigotry and Jim Crow. But he says this, between 1890, when slavery is eliminated, right, and 1940, black marriage rates in the U.S. were higher than white marriage rates. In the 1940s and 50s, black labor participation rates exceeded those of whites. Black incomes grew much faster than white incomes, and the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points. Between 1940 and 1970, that is during Jim Crow and prior to the era of affirmative action, the number of blacks in middle-class professions quadrupled. In other words, racial gaps were narrowing, steady progress was being made. Blacks today hear plenty about what they can achieve due to the legacy of slavery and not enough about what they did in fact achieve, notwithstanding hundreds of years in bondage followed by decades of legal separation. In the post-60s era, these positive trends would slow, stall, or in some cases even reverse course. The homicide rate for black men fell by 18% in the 1940s and another 22% in the 1950s. But in the 1960s, all of those gains would vanish as the homicide rate for black males rose by nearly 90%. Are today's black violent crime rates a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, or of something else? Well, obviously they are a legacy of the 60s, of the Great Society, of the liberal policies that have been imposed on these peoples. You can see it in every Democrat city where our citizens, our neighbors who are black, are suffering under these policies. This narrative, this racial narrative that this scurrilous press has imposed on our conversation, and the scurrilous left, which the press is the mouthpiece of, is destroying our people. It's destroying our people. Trump Donald Trump is not always a good person. He's not always a good man. He doesn't always do the right thing. But if he destroys this narrative like a bull in a china shop, he will be doing God's work, and he will be doing more for this country than the left has ever done.